Thank you, Mr. Takehiko Nakao, ABB President, for having us here today. Mr. Christopher Stephens, thank you for your message. Dr. Arnold Trail-Huber, Head of UNEP International Unit. Friends from the various Supreme Courts of Asia, media, ABB, environmentalists, climate activists, if there are. At the outset, allow me to thank and congratulate the Asian Development Bank and its partners, the Philippine Supreme Court and the UNEP, for making climate change the central theme of this symposium. Let me begin my brief presentation with a very basic question, perhaps too basic for judges and chief justices such as yourselves. What is justice? The answer is simple. Justice is giving everyone their due. My next question is something I want each of us to reflect on and to relate to the concept of justice. Do the future generations, our children, and our children's children deserve the earth we are leaving behind for them? In a landmark decision 23 years ago, the Philippine Supreme Court upheld the concept of intergenerational responsibility as mentioned by your Chief Justice. And I wish to share a quote from that decision. If I'm not mistaken, this is a case of Attorney Oposa, multi-site awardee, and the ponente at the time was Chief Justice Hilario Garcia. And I quote, "The day would not be too far when all else would be lost, not only for the present generation, but also for those to come. Generations which stand to inherit nothing but parched earth incapable of sustaining life," unquote. Who would have thought that such prophecy 23 years ago would actually happen within our lifetime? We see it now unraveling before our very eyes. Sea level rise threatens to submerge island nations. Ocean acidification causing irreversible damage to our coral reefs. In fact, just 2 days ago, as Chairman of Finance and I heard the 3.3 trillion budget of the Philippine government, and looking at the budget of the DNR, I asked them, in an archipelago of 27 million hectares of coral reefs, how much remains good? And they answered me, less than 1% is in excellent condition and 5% good of the 27 million hectares. Considering that our country is mostly populated, more than 60%, of rural fisher folks and farmers. This would mean starvation and death in a few decades if we don't rehabilitate our coral reefs. We see the sudden shifts from hot temperatures, incessant rains, pose uncertainties to agriculture, greatly affecting our food security. I think the FAO had predicted that by 2050, if it's business as usual for our country, we would have near zero fish catch. The warming climate is now even threatening one of the most significant World Heritage Sites in the Philippines, and I'm referring to the Ifugao rice terraces. Extreme rainfall, heavy floods constantly threaten lives, livelihood, and development. In last year's climate change negotiations in Paris, the Philippines still chaired the CVF, or the Climate Vulnerable Forum, and we led the call to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius to be able to survive. It's Ethiopia who leads the CVF now. Governments convey the message that they are determined to act to achieve the goal of limiting the world's rise in average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. We've already breached the 1 degree Celsius. Yolanda, Sendong, Ondoy, Pablo happened even when we were below a 1 degree Celsius. Is not that the greatest injustice when the Philippines is a 0.3 degree emitter in the world, but we bear the brunt of all the natural hazards, be it incessant rains and typhoons and storm surges and tsunamis, with a very vulnerable population 15 million of whom are the indigenous people who live in our mountains and in the rural areas. The 2015 Paris Agreement is a landmark agreement in the history of humankind. Its aspirations, however, will not happen on its own. Bending the global warming curve to 1.5 degrees Celsius is a moral imperative. It means saving lives and livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people. It means upholding the human rights of the poor and the vulnerable. It means ensuring the integrity of our ecosystems. The Philippines committed to a conditional 70% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by year 2030 from the sectors of energy, transport, waste, industry, and forestry. Underscore conditional. So business and industry and leaders of government should not fear our submission, and we should ratify immediately. Once it is transmitted to the Philippine Senate, I hope to help shepherd the concurrence in the ratification of this very important agreement. While the Paris Agreement acknowledges that developing nations like the Philippines will take time to decarbonize and will be able to do so only with external support, we should not stick to business as usual in the way we pursue development, especially since we have also committed to building the resilience of our communities and promoting sustainable and inclusive growth in accordance with what the ADB President mentioned, the Sendai Framework for Action. Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which was adopted in March 2015 in Sendai, Japan, and the Sustainable Development Goals adopted by the United Nations in New York last September of 2015. We must clearly deliver on these commitments. Unfortunately, here in the Philippines, the consumption of coal has been on the upswing, and we have to balance this with economic development as well, increasing by 27% between 2012 and 2014. Some might argue that coal is cheap. I say it is not. When you measure the externalities to coal, it affects our health, it kills biodiversity and the environment, it affects our waters and pollutes the air that we breathe. When we think about coal and how it's used in power plants, we know that first it is mined, it is washed, it is transported. And this process alone, without a single watt of electricity generated yet, already produces pollution. Coal is burned to generate electricity, and its byproduct in the form of ash is either recycled into cement or construction products, stored or disposed into dry and wet landfills. Leakage from these landfills can contaminate ground and surface water with arsenic, cadmium, and lead, just to name a few. The World Health Organization concluded in 2014 that air quality in most cities worldwide, and I quote, fails to meet WHO guidelines for safe levels, putting people at additional risk of respiratory diseases and other health problems, unquote. This study covers 1,600 cities across 91 countries. It had attributed that air quality decline to a host of factors, including the reliance on fossil fuels such as coal-fired power plants. The United Nations estimates that 26% of global mercury emissions come from the combustion of coal in power plants. Beyond the health impact of coal-based energy production lie the severe and irreversible impact of climate change across the world. Two of the major greenhouse gases contributing to climate change are produced by coal combustion: carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. And as concentrations of these gases in the atmosphere accumulate, global temperature increases, setting into motion absolute consequences of climate change. Which brings me to my question. Having stated all these, is everything lost? The Philippines is a country rich in renewable energy resources. The amount of sun and wind is more than enough to actually power the entire country many times over. We have the Renewable Energy Law of 2008, and though we may not totally ban coal completely immediately, we should have a good energy mix where there is a clear bias for renewables. The nation can no longer afford to have short-sighted and myopic plans. We must rethink socio-economic development beyond expediency and short-term goals. Taking the path of the low-carbon development is a just and the right way. It presents enormous opportunities for green growth, green jobs, a recently enacted law, and ensures a sustainable, secure, and resilient future for all. The Philippine Development Plan should define clearly how the country will tread the low-carbon development pathway and how our sectors will pursue the transition towards sustainable development goals. And it is on this note that I laud the world's first climate change and human rights petition in the Philippines against the carbon majors or the world's biggest polluters, including the largest fossil fuel companies, which are responsible for an estimated 65% of all anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions between 1751 and 2013. The petition was filed by environmental groups and individuals led by Greenpeace Southeast Asia Philippines before the Commission on Human Rights, the CHR of the Philippines. The CHR sent copies of the petition to the carbon majors last July 27 of this year. The companies are expected to submit the reply to the Commission within this month. In the Philippine Senate, I also filed a resolution calling for an inquiry in native legislation on the alleged detrimental and health impacts and human rights infringements arising from the operation of coal-fired power plants in the country. We seek to determine the viability of imposing a moratorium on the issuance of environmental clearance certificates for the construction of additional coal-fired power plants and the development of a clear policy towards a low-carbon economy in light of the Philippines' international commitments. I would likewise urge the Philippine Senate to lead the conduct of an environmental audit of relevant national agencies and local government units in relation to their compliance to and enforcement of environmental laws. Our goal is to introduce measurable indicators and targets to identify where implementation can be supported and to encourage public accountability of all government officials. The Philippines has the best laws in the world, lauded by the United Nations. We have numerous laws and policies focused on addressing issues on environment, public health, and disaster risk reduction. The Philippine Environment Impact Assessment System, the Marine Pollution Control Law, the Clean Air Act, which I authored in my first term in 1999, the Clean Water Act in 2003, RA 9003, the Ecological Solid Waste Management Law of 2001, the Environmental Education and Awareness Law, the Climate Change Act of 2009, which created the Commission on Climate Change, the Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Law of 2011, the Toxic Substances and Hazardous and Nuclear Waste Control Act, and the Act creating the People's Survival Fund, which is similar to the Green Climate Fund, and we have funded this with 2 billion pesos, which can be accessed by local governments and people's organizations. These are just some of the, I believe, well-written and well-intentioned laws in the Philippines. These laws, however, do not guarantee effective action. The United Nations once lauded the country's laws on climate change and disaster resilience as model legislation. However, it also noted that the challenge is to actually translate these national policies and plans and programs into actual local action with measurable gains. One concrete example is RA 9003, or the Ecological Solid Waste Management Law, which I wrote as a neophyte senator in 1998 and had a difficult time in enacting until the Payatas tragedy happened and my colleagues minded this young senator then, and finally was enacted in January of 2001. It's been 15 years since that law was enacted, and less than 50% of our local government's 1,632 cities and municipalities actually implemented. Of the 42,000 barangays, we have model barangays, and my question is, if it can be implemented by one city, one town, and one barangay, why not the whole country? And so, what did we do? We partnered with the Office of the Ombudsman. The Office of the Ombudsman in the Philippines has taken steps to push for stronger compliance, even launching a program that encourages voluntary compliance with the law. But still, many local governments failed to heed the warnings. And so, the Ombudsman filed cases against non-compliant local governments, particularly those that still operate open dump sites, because they would have been outlawed and banned by this law. Those who have not built the MRF or the material recovery facilities and do not implement segregation at source, recycling, and composting, and those who have not submitted their 10-year solid waste management plan. 15 years indeed is too long for a grace period, and there should be no acceptable excuse for non-compliance. As the famous legal maxim goes, the law may be harsh, but it is the law. Thus, let cases be filed to enforce compliance by those who are failing to do their duty. Climate change is the greatest humanitarian challenge of the century, and we must do everything in our power to address this crisis now. The presence of international agreements and local laws may not be enough to keep us alive. We need effective and fair enforcement of our environmental laws for the Earth to be able to sustain life in the succeeding centuries. We must uphold the rule of law for the sake of our planet. For the vulnerable, we seek climate justice now to restore the dignity of those suffering and to strengthen the resilience of the poor and the recovering. For the sake of future generations, we seek a commitment to act now and to implement a sustainable and holistic solution. Reducing disaster risk and adapting to climate change effectively is social justice in action. We are called upon to do more for the poor, the marginalized, the differently abled, the disenfranchised, our indigenous people, who are bound to suffer most from apathy and inaction with the increasing prevalence of climate change and disaster risks. As we respond, we ask, how can local risk governance actually be strengthened? How can resilience of livelihoods be enhanced? How can we preserve the integrity of our ecosystems? How do we ensure the resilience of our culture and our indigenous peoples? Let us use the power of the law while we still have ecosystems to rehabilitate and species to protect. Because if we have already lost all these, our loss will only be as good as an expired license. The future of humanity and of the Earth depends on what we do now and what we will fail to do. Let us not make failure an option. Let us make resilience and sustainability our future. Thank you.